Up next on the TWIP Network, Gordon Lang and I review the Fujifilm X70 on All About the Gear. Hello, it's Doug Kay, and I'm here with Gordon Lang once again, and we've got another great review for you on All About the Gear. How are you, Gordon?
I'm very well, Doug. How are you?
I'm doing great. We got a little messed up on time zones. The U.S. is on daylight savings time. The U.K. is not yet. That'll give you a clue as to when we recorded this. Anyway, we've got another great, well, I won't say great. It's up to you to tell us if it's great or not. Another Fujifilm camera. This time it is the X70. What is the X70, Gordon? That's a new camera, isn't it?
It is. Now, I'm going to start by showing you the X-T1. This is a Fujifilm X-T1. It's one of my favorite cameras. It's my own one, actually. Now, imagine you love this camera. You love the image quality of this camera. You love the controls of this camera, but if only it was smaller. So what the X70 is, imagine the X-T1 with the viewfinder shaved off, with a slimmer body and a fixed lens. And this is what you get. This is the X70, which, as you can see, is considerably smaller than the X-T1. So the really simple review of this camera is that it's a more portable version of the X-T1 and the X-T10 while still delivering pretty much the same image quality, because the X70 has the same X-Trans 2 sensors, so that's 16 megapixel APS-C. The really big difference is that it does not take interchangeable lenses. This is a fixed lens. You can't remove it. And it's also not a zoom either. It's equivalent to 28mm wide angle. It's f2.8 focal ratio. So it's a fixed lens, but it's got the same sensor and the same image processing as the X-T1 and X-T10. So if you like the quality of those, and I know you do, I know I do, then this is the most portable way of achieving it.
Well, that's great. Gordon, thanks for a great review, and we'll see you next time on All About the Gear. Oh, no, wait, we have a little more to say about it. I had a chance to get my hands on one just the other day, and, for those people who haven't had the chance, that is beautiful. That's a really nice little camera. The Fuji controls are just the best, in my opinion. I don't know what you think about them, but it's just great to be able to pick up a camera that, as you can see, it's got a real shutter speed dial. It has real aperture controls. It has an exposure compensation dial. And it's not like the X Pro 2 that we just reviewed. It doesn't have the ISO control embedded in the shutter speed. But let me say, before we go back to that, this camera is $700 US, which makes
it's about 500. Yeah, it's about £500 in the UK.
Yeah. So, what have they done in terms of features on this thing, in terms of autofocus and things like that? Now, it doesn't have a viewfinder, does it?
No, that's probably the first thing we should mention. As I said at the beginning, imagine the X-T1 and the X-T10 without a viewfinder. The X70 here, the compact version, does not have a built-in viewfinder, electronic or optical. So at this point, I'm going to mention the X100T because Fujifilm has already attempted the idea of a portable X body before, and it's on its third iteration of it. In fact, the X100T, very nice compact, fixed 35mm lens. Again, you can't remove it. But it does have that hybrid viewfinder that you find on the X Pro 2. So it has an optical rangefinder view, an electronic viewfinder, and also this hybrid version, which overlays a little bit of the electronic viewfinder in the corner. But apparently, Fujifilm tell me that everybody who owned or tried the X100T, they said, we love the X100T, but if only it was a little bit smaller and the lens was a little bit wider. So that's what they've done with the X70. It is smaller, it is lighter because it doesn't have a viewfinder, and it is wider. It's 28mm instead of 35mm equivalent. Now, it does have a hotshoe on the top, and this would lead you to believe that there is probably a viewfinder accessory, and there is. I have it here. It is, however, not an electronic viewfinder. It is an optical rangefinder. If I just slide that on, you can see that in the video. In fact, you can probably see me through it.
I can.
A little hole at the top.
Yes.
Now, this is a very simple viewfinder. It simply has, in fact, I'm going to try holding it. Look at that. You can actually see me, and you can see the guidelines on it. Now, you'll see two rectangles on there. The inner rectangle represents 28mm coverage, which is the standard coverage of the lens. And the wider frame represents, I think, 21mm equivalent, which is what you get if you attach the optional wide-angle converter lens. Now, the camera also allows you to apply a crop, like a digital zoom, to the field of view to simulate 35mm and 50mm coverage. But all that does is take a crop and interpolate it. So it's really not that much different to doing a kind of imagery size in Photoshop. There is a reduction in quality. So the first thing to say about this camera is you really do have to be at peace with the idea of having a fixed lens that's fixed at 28mm, which is, of course, a wide-angle focal length. And I think we're going to discuss this throughout the review, but I'm just going to jump in right now and say when I first heard about the X70, I kind of groaned a little bit because if you're only going to have one lens, 28mm is arguably a little bit wide. Maybe 35 is more appropriate for, if you only ever have one lens. But of course, they already have a 35mm compact in the X100T. But the big surprise for me when shooting with the X70 is just how flexible 28mm turned out to be. Obviously, it's great for landscapes, interiors, buildings, larger group shots. Obviously, you don't want to get too close with this if you're doing a single-person portrait because they'll become distorted. But if there's 2 or 3 people in the shot and you stand back a bit, it looks okay. It focuses quite close, so you can use it for some food photography. I've done that. You can see all my samples at cameralabs.com. You can also, at f2.8, 28mm, you're not going to achieve a massively shallow depth of field, but if you're very close to the subject, you can get a little bit of background blurring. So overall, this lens was actually a lot more flexible than I thought in practice. What do you think of having a fixed 28mm?
Yeah, in fact, I know that very well because my Leica Q has a 28mm f1.7 fixed lens, and I had the same reaction when it first came out. And it was the only lens that you could, have on that camera. It's permanently attached. I said, I'm really used to a 35. A 28 is going to feel very wide to me. In fact, I have learned to love the 28. It is great. It's a 24 megapixel camera as opposed to this, which is 16. So if I want to crop, I have a few more pixels to work with, not a whole lot. But for street photography, the 28 is marvelous. I wouldn't shy away from it at all. I have a question about that viewfinder, though. Is it entirely passive? Are there any electrical connections?
It is entirely passive. That is all it's doing is providing an optical window, a kind of guideline of what you're going to shoot with. Now, I tried to have a failed love affair with rangefinders a long time ago with medium format. I was seduced by the quality and the kind of immediacy of it, but I just couldn't get on with it. Some people love rangefinder viewfinders, some people don't. I'm of that latter camp. I can't use them. I like to shoot very precise pictures that are very square, geometrically correct, and I really, really exploit things like guidelines in electronic views to make sure everything is centered and square. It's very hard for me to do that with one of these viewfinders. So really all it's doing is giving you a rough idea of the frame. And obviously as you begin to move closer to subjects, there's some parallax issues. It's not an electronic frame like you get on the hybrid viewfinder of the X Pro 2 or the X100T. It is just a passive view, and it ain't cheap either. This viewfinder is a $200 accessory. So it does raise the price of this quite considerably to the point where you could, of course, buy an alternative compact, like say a Sony RX100, which has a zoom lens and a built-in electronic viewfinder. So you have to really kind of weigh that up.
That's interesting because, again, as a street photographer, the things that you're looking for are the exact opposite. I love the fact it's close enough for street photography work, and the ability, as you said when we were looking at the X Pro 2, the ability to see beyond the edges of the frame is really a nice feature, and rangefinders are great for that. Again, with the 28mm lens, you'll have a very deep depth of field. You can shoot at f5.6, let's say, and you get some great stuff. So that's handy. Although, as you point out, you add $200 to this, that gets it up to $900 US, and it's starting to get close to the price of the X100T.
Exactly, but it's a different proposition. The idea is that you don't shoot all the time with that little viewfinder on it, and you've got, the most compact way to enjoy that X-Trans sensor and the Fuji processing. Before we talk about that a bit more, can I take you around some of the controls?
Please do.
Okay, so it really is like a baby XT10 or XT1, and as you said, the thing about Fujifilm's approach to controls is it's a very kind of retro style. It's a nod to older film cameras. So you have a shutter speed dial, and you have an aperture ring on the lens. Hopefully you can see that aperture ring there, there's actually two little handles on either side that let you turn that. I'm going to show you that from the front as well. So you can kind of hold it like this and turn the aperture of the lens there. So rather than choosing program or aperture priority or shutter priority or manual, you do it all with these two dials. So if you want it to shoot in program, you set both dials to A. So you turn the aperture ring to A and you turn the shutter speed dial to A. If you want to go into aperture priority, you leave the shutter speed dial in A and you just choose the aperture from the ring. Likewise, for shutter priority, you just reverse that, and if you want full manual, you just set them both manually to whatever you want. It's very immediate. It's surprisingly intuitive if you've not used a system like that before. I mean, Doug and I have been around the block a few times, so we both remember a time when this was the only way to control cameras, and it's quite refreshing to see it again. You've also got, before I move on, I should say, you'll notice on that shutter speed dial, the range goes from 1 second to 4,000th of a second, which will cover most eventualities. Now, 4,000th of a second is the fastest mechanical shutter on this camera, but because it is inside, basically the same as an X-T10 or an X-T1 running the latest firmware, there is also an electronic shutter that will go up to 32,000th of a second. And as an electronic shutter, it's completely silent. So that's very stealthy if you're a street photographer. That could be quite handy. And coupled with the screen, which I'm going to show you in a minute, then you can already begin to imagine what you're able to do with this camera. If you want to access shutter speeds faster than 4,000th or slower than 1 second, you can actually use this little jog kind of control on the back. It looks like a wheel, but it is actually just a control you can push to one side, to the other side, or click in. And I should mention that when you're composing, you can click in for a magnified view of the active focus area, or in playback, you can click in to immediately magnify what was the active focus area. So it's a really quick way of confirming whether your focus is correct. That's really nice. If you put this camera, set it to T, which comes after the 1 second mark, that is how you access exposures up to 30 seconds. And again, like the X-T10 and the X-T1 running the latest update, you can pretty much control the shutter speed with this little control here if you prefer. So Fujifilm gives you lots of different ways of doing it. I mean, tell me what you think of having the separate shutter speed dial and the aperture ring and this way of controlling it.
It's absolutely my favorite way of doing it. I mean, we call them retro design, but to my mind, it's the best because if you want to change the shutter speed, you simply change the shutter speed. Same with the aperture. You don't have to configure it. You don't have to concern yourself with which wheel it is. To go from from automatic aperture, for example, to a specific aperture, you just do one thing. As you said, you change the aperture dial. Very, very simple. I think on this, I don't know if it's on this camera, but on some of the others, if you want to go in between some of those shutter speeds, because those shutter speeds are 1 EV apart, 1 stop apart. But if you wanted to go between a 500th and a 1,000th, does that little jog wheel get you there?
Absolutely. So this little jog wheel basically lets you go 2/3 of a stop on either side of the selected shutter speed. And when you're at that point, to me, it seems a bit of a faff because you've set a shutter speed there and then you go into the dial to select that. So if you think you're going to do that a lot, you may not like it, or you may want to just set this to T and just adjust it with this control alone. That's something that they didn't do originally on the X-T1, but they modified that in a firmware update. And I think it was a sensible thing to do because sometimes you do just want to select it with this dial instead. But, single EV increments isn't the end of the world. And, of course, you do have 1/3 increments on the aperture ring, so you can fine-tune with that. So in front of the aperture ring, you have this knurled ring. Is knurled a real word?
I believe it is.
Well, then it's a knurled ring. It's very narrow, but you can turn it, as you can see here. And by default, this operates things like the manual focus, as you would expect, but it is actually a configurable function control. There is a little button here. It's quite well hidden if you haven't seen the camera before. This little button on the side, and if you press and hold that, you can change the function of this wheel. So you could get it to say just the digital teleconverter or the ISO. And most of these other controls are also configurable. You can configure them by going into a menu, but in a quite nice function, you can just press and hold them for a couple of seconds and it will bring up the option to change them on screen, which is a really nice way of operating it. Like the trash button here on the back, I reconfigured this during composition to act as the ISO button, because pretty much everything else is covered. You've got exposure compensation on the dial, you've got aperture and shutter, you've got a dedicated button for the drive mode on the top. So the only other thing that I change frequently is the ISO, but you could, of course, change that to white balance or reconfigure the cross keys here as well.
I don't know why I didn't think of that. That's similar to getting into the car and pushing the station button. You tune in a new station, you hold the button down, you wait long enough, it sets the button. That is a brilliant idea. I love that.
I'm going to go around to the side here and show you the ports. There's the same 3 ports that you find on an XT1 or an XT10, I believe. It's definitely the XT1 because I've got it next to me and I can see them. You have a USB port, you have an HDMI port, a little smaller one, and you also have a small jack for a remote cable release accessory, although you can, and I have used it with a trigger trap accessory cable, which plugs into, well, mine is a USB version, so it plugs into the USB port. And in the same way that I use my XT1 for long exposure photography, I've done long exposures with the X70, 2-minute exposures of Brighton's Old Pier. You can see those pictures again on my sample images page at cameralabs.com, and they look fine. They look exactly the same as the XT1 would, because inside it's pretty much the same camera. However, there's one important difference with these ports. The USB port is now how you charge the camera. You now charge the battery inside the camera, like a Sony RX100 series, and you do it with a USB connection. And I know there'll be some old school people who'll be throwing their hands up in despair, but I'm not one of them. I'm throwing my hands up in joy because I love USB charging in camera, because I don't need to find an AC socket to charge the camera. I don't need to bring the charger to charge the camera. All I need to do is find something that can power it over USB, like my laptop, like a portable battery that I carry around with me in case I need to top up my phone, or the ports that are in my car or any number of vehicles. You can top it up between shooting locations in your bag or your vehicle, and for me, that is definitely the future for smaller cameras. What do you think about USB charging?
I'm a fan. You've converted me entirely. It's one less gadget to carry around. It's one less gadget to lose. So, yeah, here, I love it.
Okay, now one last thing to mention at the top. This is something inherited from the XT10. There's a little switch that switches it into auto. If you're a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's like a don't panic button or a switch. You just flick it, it becomes fully automatic, and you can then just hand it to someone and hope they don't run off with it and get them to take that picture of you when you're on holiday.
That's a brilliant idea. I didn't realize that the other camera had that too. I thought that was simply the on-off switch, but I see the on-off switch is separate from that.
That's right.
Very good.
Now let's talk about the screen, because the screen really is a unique thing about this camera. Like the XT1, let me just go back to the XT1 here. So here's the XT1, and the screen flips up by 90 degrees. That's for composing at low angles, or back by about 45 degrees for framing over your head. It's not side hinged, hopefully on a future model. Now, if we turn to the X70, you'll see that the screen does also flip out to 90 degrees, or does it? Look, it keeps on going. It flips by 180 degrees, which means you can use it for self-portraits, and it does indeed switch itself, as you'd hope, into a self-portrait mode with face detection. And I should also say that, again, because it inherits the latest firmware of the Fuji cameras, you get really good eye detection as well, if you want. It's something you have to enable in a menu. Why isn't it just on by default with face detection? I don't know, that's Sony's approach as well. Let's give them face detection, but they have to ask for the eye detection, because I can imagine a scenario when you want to detect a face but not the eye. Yes, definitely. I've no idea why that happens.
I wonder if it slows down the processing, if it uses more compute power.
That would be your assumption, but it doesn't seem to slow it down. So if it took twice as long, then yes, there would be a point to that. Now, of course, it also flips down, but this screen... So actually, it's the first Fujifilm screen on an X series that can do this for selfies, but it is also the first Fujifilm screen on an X series that is...
Wait for it.
Touch sensitive.
Is it touch? Yeah.
It's touch sensitive. It's the first one. You can reposition the AF area by touch, which is brilliant. I wish it was on every camera. I keep going on about it, so I'm not going to go on about it too much, but I love having touch screens. You can turn it off if you want. There is a touch shutter option. I don't particularly like using that, so I turn it off. I just use it for tapping to refocus. You can also use the touchscreen if you like. You can turn it off to swipe between images and playback, to also enlarge or shrink by pinch. I don't do that. You know, again, you use it as you wish. I use it to reposition the AF area. But unfortunately, because Fujifilm is quite new to this, they haven't really deployed it in as many ways as they could. You can't, for example, tap to reposition the AF area while you're filming a movie, so you can't pull focus by touch, which is a missed opportunity. I'm also going to try switching it on. Now, we may not be able to see this on the video. I'm going to hold up. Oh, no, you can.
See it quite well.
Yeah, this is Fujifilm's Q menu, which will be familiar to anyone who's used a Fujifilm camera up to this point, because it's pretty much the same. Now, look at those big chunky icons. You would normally use the cross keys here to choose the option you want. But wouldn't it be nice if you could just tap it, right? Nice big chunky buttons. No. The screen is not touch sensitive for the menus. And that, to me, yeah, sure, I understand it in the main menu system, but for the Q menu, surely those big chunky buttons are just crying out to be touch sensitive. So to me, that's a bit of a missed opportunity. But what do I know?
Well, we know that Fuji are very good about listening to customers. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that came with a future firmware upgrade.
I really hope
it's so obvious.
But in the meantime, hopefully, maybe you can't see that. Maybe it's not working.
Absolutely, we can see it. You know, even stodgy old Leica puts touch in on the Leica Q. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of a camera like this, but yeah, a touch screen is something that's quite nice when it's there.
So as you can see, the AF system, which is inherited from the X-T1 and the X-T10, isn't bad. It's not the world's fastest, because of course it's also dependent on the lens that's in front of it, but it's pretty snappy, and it also inherits the phase detect AF points that are in the center of the sensor. Fujifilm's just done a little cluster of them, so it does actually do a half decent job at continuously autofocusing on moving subjects, although with a wide angle lens you're not going to really be pushing that, but it is at least on there. And there's not a lot of compact cameras that do have embedded phase detect AF points, so that actually gives the X70 a bit of a unique selling point.
Yeah. Hey, you mentioned, when you were talking about the touchscreen, you mentioned video. What does this camera have in the way of video?
Well, again, it's equivalent to what you get with the X-T10 and the X-T1 with the latest firmware update. So it will film 1080 at 24, 25, 30, 50 or 60p, which is nice, because when cameras like the X-T1 first came out, they had, as I recall, I think it was just like 30 or 60p, and that was it. There weren't any other options. However, with the X-Trans 2 sensor, which is optimized for still photography, it doesn't deliver very good video quality. Now, I am pleased to report that on the X Pro 2, which has the X-Trans 3 sensor, they have improved that a lot. It's still not industry leading, but they've improved it a lot. But that's no consolation if you buy this camera, because it is the same as what you get with the X-T1 and the X-T10. It will film video, but it's not fantastic at it. And the options you get are pretty minimal. You can set the ISO, you can set the aperture prior to filming, things like that, but there's not a great deal of control over the movie quality, the movie exposure, or things like the movie processing. You know, I mean, if you're into applying flat profiles for subsequent grading and stuff like that, this is not really the camera for you.
Yeah. Do you have your Sony RX100 within reach?
I do, as it happens.
Because when I got to see this X70, my first question was to compare the sizes. So for those who aren't seeing the video, tell us what the size difference is. Okay,
so if I place them side by side, the X70 is only a little bit taller. If we look at them from above, the X70 is a tad thicker. The biggest difference in dimension is the length, which, as you can see here, if I line up the RX100 on one side, you can see it's probably about a centimetre wider. Weight-wise, they're quite similar. Now, I would say the X70 is beginning to push it for trouser pocketability. It will just about, and I have, although it was fairly unsightly, I should add. It is more comfortable in a bag. I mean, obviously also if you have the viewfinder on top, but it will just about squeeze into a pocket. It's not quite as small as the Sony RX100 series, which of course it is also still quite a chunky compact. So these are smaller if you want a smaller camera. But for me, the really interesting discussion is a fixed lens versus a zoom lens, and as importantly, a lens on the Fuji which does not have optical stabilization versus a lens on the Sony and the Canon, pretty much everyone else that does have optical stabilization, and also a difference in focal ratio. The reason I'm telling you all of this is regular viewers of All About the Gear or visitors to Camera Labs will know that the X70 has an APS-C sensor, and the RX100 has a 1-inch sensor, which is smaller, quite significantly smaller. And unsurprisingly, the X70 performs better in terms of noise levels and dynamic range at high ISOs. If you set both of these cameras to 3200 ISO, and I've got a full set of noise resources at Camera Labs, the Fujifilm unsurprisingly beats it. But that is not the end of the discussion, because that does not necessarily tell you how you're going to use these cameras in real life. You see, the maximum aperture on the X70 is f2.8. The maximum aperture on the RX100 series and the Canon G series and almost all these products, almost all of them, when they're zoomed to wide, have got an f1.8 or an f2 focal ratio, which makes them at least one stop brighter than the Fujifilm. So already it's clawed back a stop of ISO. So when you're shooting with this Fujifilm at 3200, you could in fact be shooting the Sony and the Canons at 1600 or maybe 1250 ISO. So that brings back a bit of that. But most of these 1-inch class compacts not only have zoom lenses, not only have brighter lenses, but they also have optical stabilization. Now, if you're shooting somebody moving along, again, in a street environment, then you just simply need a certain shutter speed to freeze them, right? So optical stabilization is not going to help you there. But if you're shooting a building or a landscape or a mostly static subject, then optical stabilization can really help. Typically, cameras like the Canon and the Sonys will give you 3 stops of stabilization. That is letting you set an ISO 3 stops slower. And remember that ISO was already a stop slower due to its brighter aperture to start with. So you could in fact claw up to 4 stops back of ISO if you're not shooting a moving subject. So instead of 3200 ISO, you're shooting at 1600, no, 800, no, 400, no, 200 ISO. That's 4 stops difference.
So you're getting back some of that difference in noise.
Yes.
By going to essentially having more light using a lower ISO. So now that 1-inch sensor, which would be more noise prone, is catching up or maybe even surpassing the larger APS-C sensor in terms of noise performance. Interesting.
It is. Depending on how you're going to use these cameras. Now, that's how I would use these cameras, because I am mostly shooting static subjects. That is of no consolation if you're shooting moving subjects, because you need a certain shutter speed, and if the light is low, you need a high ISO. And in that scenario, the X70 is going to win because it's got a physically bigger sensor. And again, that brings us back to this whole idea that the X70 is a camera that's fantastic for street shooting, especially when you imagine being able to flip out the screen, to set it to the electronic shutter, which is silent, and to be able to tap the screen as well to take the picture. It all becomes a very, very small and discreet camera, and that is something that's very important to people who are into street photography.
Yeah, also, as you're just showing on the video, that tilting screen means you can put it down at waist level. You can pretend you're Vivian Maier using a Rolleiflex, and it's great. Both cameras are marvelous. I don't have the Fuji. I do own a Sony, and it's the second camera I take with me everywhere. No matter what my first camera is, my Sony RX100 is always my second camera. It's a 24-70 in my pocket, as I've said before. Covers a lot of situations that other cameras don't.
That's right. I should also say, Doug, that you can mount filters on the X70, which makes it kind of more sophisticated than products like the RX100. You do need an adapter to do it. The front actually unscrews, which I'm going to do now to show you.
Sure
this
enough.
front part comes off, and you're left with a thread on the outside. Now, if your filters have a thread on the inside, then you can actually attach them straight onto this. None of mine do. So you need an adapter for them. And Fujifilm sells that adapter, and it's exactly the same one, I believe, as the X100 series. So if you already have an adapter for that, then it will work on this. And like I say, I use this very successfully for long exposure photography in exactly the same way as I would shoot with the XT1, which is really nice because, if you're an XT1 owner or an XT10 owner and you just want a smaller version, and I hear that all the time from passionate Fujifilm owners. They all say that. They're very excited about this product.
Yeah, you know, the one thing that's missing in my mind, I just remember when I saw this on this camera, because it's supposed to be an almost pocketable camera, I wish it had an electronic lens cap. Because that lens looks a bit vulnerable. It's right out near the front. You put it in your pocket. Maybe your keys are in your pocket too. Now you've got a problem. So what's that in your right hand there? What have you got?
Okay, so this is the cap. I'm really glad you brought up that point, Doug, because I have mentioned this before in some reviews, and people pull me up on it and say you're being mad here. But it's a very good point. Here's the RX100 II in my right hand, which has a motorized, well, kind of mechanical lens cover. So when I switch it on, if I've seen something over there, I want to take a picture of it, I switch it on, lens extends, and it opens up, and I'm ready for action. I didn't need to use any of the fingers or anything. It was a one-handed operation. I didn't need to put anything in my pocket. It was ready to go. Okay. Now, if I switch on the Fujifilm, so it's off at the moment, if I switch it on, you'll see the lens does, it's ready for action. That's fantastic. Except it's not, because I had already taken off the lens cap. So here's the lens cap, which comes with it. It's a nice, solid, robust lens cap. You know, you're going to protect the camera very nicely with this. And I do appreciate that you could stick your finger through one of those little thin mechanical ones on a compact, although I never have. Mm-hmm. Just thought I'd say that. But with this, I'm now using both hands to take that off. I've got to put this somewhere, put it in my pocket or something. This is all taking precious time. So that is something that's worth bearing in mind. The cameras that have the built-in lens covers are faster to action if you're carrying it around with the cover attached. Of course, if you're not, then this is going to be pretty quick because you're not waiting for the lens to extend. There's no zoom to worry about. It is very responsive otherwise, but it is a point worth making.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole idea to me of a compact camera, particularly one that doesn't have an interchangeable lens, is that you want it to be completely self-contained. You don't want extra pieces. You had the viewfinder, which, although I like the viewfinder, I don't want to carry around an extra thing. I don't want to carry around a charger. I don't want to carry around a lens cap, and I don't want to have one of those little tethers that I tie the lens cap onto the camera. And so the whole idea that I can take my, you can't see me because I have a little teeny picture, but to take my RX100, throw it in my pocket, I don't have to think, do I need some other parts to go with it? Yeah, very nice.
I should also add that, like the other recent Fujifilm cameras, it has built-in Wi-Fi. It doesn't have NFC, but there is a good app that's available for iOS and Android devices that lets you copy images wirelessly, of course. It lets you geotag them, although in a different way I'll mention in a minute. It lets you remote control the camera. You can remote control the exposure. You can't change the exposure mode, so you have to previously either set it to effectively aperture priority or manual or whatever, but once you are, you can adjust the aperture and the shutter speed using the remote app. You can see it. You can also tap to reposition the focusing area, and you can also trigger a movie recording, which you can't do with all of the alternative cameras that are out there. The geo-targeting is done a bit differently, though. What most camera apps do is the phone would record a log. So you'd say, right, I'm going to synchronize the clocks, and I'm going to say, look, just start recording a position of where I am on the phone, and then later on at some point, maybe that day, maybe later that week, I'm just going to transfer that log over and tag a load of images in one go, right? Fujifilm does it a different way. It actually effectively broadcasts over Wi-Fi from your phone, if you select the geotagging option, your position. So if the camera wakes up, switches on its Wi-Fi and goes, oh, there's the phone, there's that phone I was talking to earlier, and it seems to have a GPS position. It will pop up a little icon on the screen of a globe, which means it's now connected. And when you take the picture, it actually pulls that GPS information off the phone and embeds it straight away at the point of capture. So there is no kind of tagging after the event. This may raise concerns over battery life because effectively you are maintaining a Wi-Fi contact when you want to transfer that information. There's also the concern that when the camera wakes up again, it may not re-establish that communication. Now, that latter issue wasn't a problem with the X-T1 when I tested it. It seemed to just find the phone again and just reconnect with it without me having to do anything. However, I was playing with the X70 just before we filmed this show, and I had problems with that, and I had to keep reconnecting it. But it works, and at least they're tagged, they're embedded. I mean, if we're complaining about it, it seems a bit churlish considering Sony, for their prowess in everything else, actually doesn't offer a decent geotagging option at the moment on their smartphone apps.
Oh, very good. Well, it sounds like a nice little camera. Let's take a moment here before we end to talk about some of the competition, because it's getting, with all these different models, it's getting pretty complicated out there. And I'm trying, when Frederick and I used to do this show, he'll always used to end with, so who's this camera for? Well, we've talked about that. It's a street camera or a variety of other things, but boy, it's squeezed in between an awful lot of other cameras that are almost like it. What would you consider the competitors to this to be? I mean, where does this fit?
Well, believe it or not, the idea of a compact camera with an APS-C sensor and a fixed 28mm lens may sound fairly unique, but it already exists in two other versions. There is Nikon's Coolpix A, a camera that everyone has forgotten, but which is actually really good. It's 16 megapixels as well. It delivers surprisingly good quality. It's very small as well. I was very impressed with the quality of that, but that camera just kind of didn't really take off, and as such, there are some really good prices on that. That is available for less than the X70, although it doesn't have, it's a couple of years old now, so it doesn't have things like Wi-Fi, but it's still a good option. There's also a Ricoh model, isn't there, Doug?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the
Which one is that?
GR Mark II, which comes in $100 less expensive. It's not a camera we've reviewed on All About the Gear. The manufacturer is not all that easy to work with to get review copies, but it's $600 again. It's 16 megapixels. It's the same thing, 28 millimeter f2.8, 20 millimeter full frame equivalent, that is. Very, very popular with street photographers.
Yes, and that's really probably what this is going up against. I mean, if you're after just a high-quality compact, then you also look at the plethora of 1-inch products that are out there. Sony's RX100 series, Canon's G series. There's loads and loads of choice. Now, the thing that makes them different from products like the X70 is that they all have zoom lenses. They all have, obviously, smaller 1-inch sensors, but the fact they have optical stabilization and brighter lenses can, as I explained earlier, claw back a lot of the benefit that the Fujifilm has for having a bigger sensor to start with. You see, it's a combination of sensor size, lens aperture, and also being able to exploit things like stabilization. You have to look at all of that and how you shoot. But in terms of who it's for, I mean, as you said, street shooters are going to love this, and there's certainly a lot of Fuji street shooters. And of course, as a Fujifilm camera, you've got that fantastic image quality that we are so familiar with from the other X series products. For me, the optical quality of the lens is not quite as good towards the edges as, say, the best XF series lenses. So if you are looking to, say, absolutely match the quality of an X-T1 with a decent removable lens, you're not quite going to get there, but you've got to look closely to tell the difference. If you stop this lens down or don't look too carefully in the corners, the lens performs fine. I mean, it's just an inevitable compromise of having such a small form factor. But in terms of the image processing, it's what you're familiar with. You've got those Fujifilm film simulations, which are so beautiful, whether you're shooting in color or black and white. And the other people who are going to buy this are people who, like me, have an X-T1 or an X Pro 2, and they want a smaller camera that's going to deliver very similar quality that's, going to be with them all the time. Let's say you're shooting events or weddings or things with an X Pro or an XT, then this gives you the same style, the same image quality. It's giving you that consistency of quality and also control, but in a smaller, more portable form factor. So I could see a lot of existing Fujifilm owners being very tempted by the X70.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And because you pick it up, it has virtually the identical controls. You're very comfortable with it. You can immediately just start using this camera. And at $700, it is, you're getting almost all that Fuji quality at, one of the lowest prices. So you've got a fully capable street camera there. And, you're saving $400 off the X100T. So it's very nice.
Absolutely.
Gordon, thank you very much. It's been a great review. Fascinating little camera. Like I say, I got a chance to get my hands on one just yesterday and was much more impressed with it than I expected to be. So very, very nice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say once again, do have a look. Obviously, I'm going to encourage you to come to my review at cameralabs.com, but if nothing else, look at the sample images, not only for the lovely colors that are in them, But the flexibility of what I've taken pictures of, there's the obvious things you take with a 28mm wide-angle lens, but a lot of things that you may not expect that work much better. If you, like me, thought that 28mm was probably not the best choice if it was your only coverage, then prepare to be surprised, because I was, and having shot with this camera now, I'd be quite happy with this lens as my only focal length.
Yeah, I should say, since I do that regularly, if you do not make large prints, there's nothing wrong with 28mm. You can always crop to the equivalent of 35 or even 50mm. If what you're shooting is primarily going to be used online or in relatively small prints, it's really not a problem whatsoever. Well, thanks, Gordon, for another great review. The X70 is certainly a very interesting camera. I want to remind everybody that if you're interested in purchasing the X70 or any of the cameras that we discuss here on All About the Gear, head on over to cameralabs.com, click on the Buy Now button. It helps us keep food on the table. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on All About the Gear.